Think of your favorite classic TV star. The perfect father, the wholesome game show host, the lovable grandfather. We invited them into our living rooms every week because they made us feel safe. But what happens when the cameras stop rolling? Behind the black and white smiles and scripted morals, some of television's most beloved legends were hiding dark, abusive, and sometimes criminal realities. The people who made America laugh were often creating absolute nightmares for the people who actually had to live with them. Let's look at the real faces behind the screen. Number 1. Bing Crosby. If you grew up watching television in the mid-20th century, Bing Crosby wasn't just an entertainer. He was the blueprint for the American father. His holiday specials were practically mandatory viewing, built around a warm, effortless charm that made millions of people feel like they were sitting right there in his living room. He was the voice of White Christmas, the pipe-smoking patriarch who projected nothing but calm and reassurance to the camera. But the reality inside his actual living room was sharply different. In 1983, his eldest son, Gary, published a memoir titled Going My Own Way. The book systematically dismantled the wholesome persona the public had bought into for decades. Gary didn't just describe a strict parent. He detailed a household governed by rigid control and intense fear. He recounted how Bing would regularly weigh his sons. If the scale showed even a slight unauthorized weight gain, the consequence wasn't a gentle lecture. It was severe physical punishment. Gary wrote about enduring harsh beatings, describing an upbringing where the brothers lived in such constant dread that they would sometimes quietly fantasize about ways to get rid of their father, just to make the fear stop. It is important to acknowledge that families often hold conflicting truths, and the Crosby household was no exception. Following the book's release, the siblings were heavily divided. Philip Crosby publicly defended his father and firmly denied the allegations, while their brother Lindsay expressed sympathy for Gary and validated the harsh, unforgiving reality of their home life. We don't have a time machine to verify every interaction that happened behind those closed doors. What we do have is a profound, unsettling disconnect. The specific, painful recollections laid out in Gary's memoir stand in jarring contrast to the man who made a fortune selling comfort to the American public. Millions of people found solace in Bing Crosby's gentle demeanor, but for the boys who actually lived with him, that same voice wasn't a source of warmth, it was a signal to brace for impact. Number 2. Bob Barker. For 35 years, Bob Barker was a daily guest in millions of living rooms. He was the charming, silver-haired game show host who handed out brand new cars, spun the big wheel, and ended every single episode of The Price is Right with a heartfelt plea to help control the pet population. He projected the image of a deeply moral, gentle man who cared about the vulnerable. But if you ask the women who worked beside him, Barker's compassion seemed largely reserved for animals. The public illusion started cracking in 1994 when Diane Parkinson, one of the famous Barker's beauties, filed a lawsuit against him. She alleged that Barker had coerced her into a 3-year sexual relationship by holding her job over her head. Barker publicly admitted to the relationship but insisted it was entirely consensual, and Parkinson eventually dropped the suit due to the immense stress and financial toll of fighting a television titan. If Parkinson had been the only one, the public might have brushed it off, but her departure triggered a chain reaction that exposed the reality of his set. Holly Hallstrom, another longtime model on the show, stepped forward with a story about how Barker handled dissent. Hallstrom stated that Barker explicitly ordered her to go on television and publicly call Parkinson a liar. When she refused to participate in the smear campaign, she was abruptly fired. Hallstrom didn't just walk away, she sued for wrongful termination. It took nearly a decade of grueling litigation, a battle that drained her savings and forced her to live out of her car at one point, but she ultimately secured a multi-million-dollar settlement. Over the following years, more women, including model Kathleen Bradley and producer Deborah Curling, brought forward their own lawsuits alleging wrongful termination discrimination and a deeply toxic work environment orchestrated by the host. Barker maintained his innocence regarding the harassment claims until his retirement, and his defenders are quick to point out his undeniable charitable work. Yet the sheer volume of legal battles leaves a heavy shadow over his legacy. The man who made a career out of telling everyday people to come on down allegedly spent decades using his immense network power to keep the women around him firmly under his control. Number 3. Bob Crane. If you tuned in to CBS in the late 1960s, you knew Bob Crane as the clever, endlessly charming Colonel Hogan on Hogan's Heroes. He was the charismatic center of a massive hit, projecting an easygoing, family-friendly wit that made him a household name. He was the quintessential American television star, handsome, funny, and entirely safe. But away from the studio lights, Crane was carefully maintaining a compulsive double life that would eventually consume him entirely. While the public saw wholesome sitcom hero Crane was quietly spiraling into a severe sex addiction, heavily facilitated by the newly emerging technology of portable video cameras. He formed a close, highly toxic friendship with a video equipment salesman named John Henry Carpenter, and together they spent years aggressively pursuing women. The most disturbing aspect of this reality wasn't just the sheer volume of his encounters, it was the profound violation of consent. According to investigators and later revelations, many of the women captured on Crane's extensive cataloged collection of videotapes had absolutely no idea they were being recorded. He actively leveraged the inherent glamour of his television fame to bring women into his space, only to secretly document them to feed his private obsession. It was a calculated, predatory routine operating just beneath the surface of his Hollywood success. Eventually, the sitcom ended, but the compulsion didn't. As the 1970s wore on, Crane's career stalled, his personal life fractured, and his days devolved into a relentless pursuit of his addiction on the regional dinner theater circuit. The starkest contrast to his polished TV persona came in the summer of 1978, when Crane's life ended in a violent, unsolved homicide in a bleak, rented apartment in Scottsdale, Arizona. While Carpenter was tried and acquitted decades later, the murder remains officially unsolved. The man who spent years outsmarting the bad guys on television ultimately couldn't escape his own destructive habits. When you watch old reruns of Hogan's Heroes today, it's deeply unsettling to reconcile the bright, smiling actor on the screen with the grim reality of a man who used his fame as a tool for exploitation trading. Everything he had built for a secret life he simply couldn't control. Number 4. Johnny Carson. For 30 years, Johnny Carson was the man who tucked America in at night. As the host of The Tonight Show, he was the ultimate conversationalist, effortlessly charming, quick-witted, and capable of making any guest feel like the most interesting person in the room. He projected an aura of easy accessibility that made him one of the most trusted figures in television history. But the moment the director yelled, "Cut!" that warmth usually vanished. The ultimate conversationalist on television was by almost all accounts socially uncomfortable and fiercely emotionally guarded in real life. The sharpest look behind the curtain came from Henry Bushkin Carson's lawyer and closest confidant for over a decade. In his memoir, Bushkin painted a portrait of a man who was deeply isolated by his own design. Carson was described as quick to anger, ruthlessly dismissive, and entirely capable of cutting people out of his life without a second thought. Bushkin recalled how Carson could be incredibly generous financially, yet almost entirely bankrupt when it came to offering genuine emotional support. This coldness hit hardest at home. Carson went through 3 highly publicized bitter divorces before finally finding stability late in life, but the collateral damage heavily impacted his children. He was notoriously detached as a father. Those who knew him best often noted that he seemed to view family relationships not as a source of comfort, but as an uncomfortable burden he simply didn't know how to handle. He lacked the basic toolkit for deep, enduring personal intimacy. Carson wasn't a criminal, and his story doesn't involve the predatory behavior seen elsewhere in Hollywood. His reality was far quieter but deeply painful for the people who actually tried to love him. He possessed an incredible generational talent for connecting with millions of strangers through a camera lens. Yet, to maintain that perfect, jovial illusion for the public every single night, he seemingly had to spend every ounce of charisma he had, leaving absolutely nothing left for the family waiting for him at home. Number 5. Robert Blake. Don't do the crime if you can't do the time. That was the iconic street-smart catchphrase of Tony Beretta, the tough but deeply principled undercover detective played by Robert Blake throughout the 1970s. On television, Blake was a champion of the underdog, a fiercely moral cop who navigated a gritty urban underworld while always ensuring that justice was served. But the actor delivering those lectures on accountability eventually found himself at the center of a reality far darker than any script his network ever approved. By the late 1990s, Blake's television fame had largely faded, and his personal life had collapsed into a chaotic, deeply toxic marriage to a woman named Bonnie Lee Bakley. In the spring of 2001, Bakley was fatally shot in a car just outside a restaurant where the couple had just finished dinner. Overnight, the former television cop became the prime suspect in his wife's murder. What unfolded in the courtroom completely dismantled whatever heroic image Blake still possessed. While he was ultimately acquitted in the criminal trial, the proceedings stripped away the Hollywood veneer to reveal a volatile, deeply paranoid existence. The jury and the public listened to testimonies from former stuntmen who claimed Blake had explicitly approached them, attempting to hire them to kill his wife. The court records painted a picture of a man consumed by rage manipulation and intense desperation. The most definitive blow to his legacy came shortly after the criminal acquittal. A civil jury weighing the preponderance of evidence formally found Robert Blake liable for the wrongful death of Bonnie Lee Bakley, ordering him to pay $30 million to her surviving children. The irony is as heavy as it is inescapable. The man who became a cultural icon by playing a television detective relentlessly pursuing criminals spent his final decades entirely ostracized from Hollywood, bankrupted by civil penalties, and permanently anchored to the violent, unresolved death of his own wife. The moral compass he projected so effortlessly on screen was nowhere to be found when the cameras stopped rolling. Number 6. Jerry Lewis. For over half a century, Jerry Lewis was the undisputed king of physical comedy and a towering figure of American philanthropy. Every Labor Day, he would take over television screens across the country to host his famous telethon. Millions watched as he sang Sweat and wept openly on camera, working tirelessly to raise billions of dollars for children suffering from muscular dystrophy. To the public, he was the ultimate humanitarian, a man who dedicated his life to caring for Jerry's kids. But the compassion he broadcasted to the world was strikingly absent when he walked through his own front door. The man who cried for sick children on television ran his own household with an iron fist, leaving a trail of profound emotional damage. The reality of his home life was laid bare by the very people who lived it. His son, Gary Lewis, who had his own successful music career, publicly described his father as a deeply controlling and emotionally abusive figure. Gary stated flatly that Jerry never showed him or his brothers any real love or affection, painting a picture of a home dominated by unpredictable rage and rigid demands rather than warmth. Lewis was equally uncompromising in his professional life. He was notorious for his staggering ego and openly misogynistic views, repeatedly stating on the record that he didn't believe women were capable of being funny. He demanded total submission from those around him, punishing anyone who challenged his authority. The ultimate crushing proof of his private cruelty came after his death in 2017. When his last will and testament was unsealed, it contained a brutal final message to the family he had raised. Lewis explicitly and intentionally disinherited all 6 of the sons from his first marriage, ensuring they received absolutely nothing from his massive estate. It is a staggering contradiction to process. Jerry Lewis built a monumental career on the premise of saving families and protecting the innocent. Yet, the man who begged a nation to open their hearts to children in need actively chose to shut his own children out, enforcing a bitter grudge all the way to the grave. Number 7. Jackie Gleason. To the American public in the 1950s, Jackie Gleason was affectionately known as the Great One. As Ralph Cramden on The Honeymooners. He essentially invented the sitcom archetype of the lovable working-class blowhard. Every week, millions tuned in to watch him shout, scheme, and ultimately humble himself before his wife Alice. He projected the image of a flawed but fundamentally decent guy whose heart was always in the right place. But the man who played television's most famous everyman was running an absolute dictatorship behind the cameras. Away from the carefully framed shots of his fictional Brooklyn apartment, Gleason's life was defined by a staggering ego and severe chronic alcoholism. On set, he famously refused to rehearse. He would often show up just before the cameras rolled heavily intoxicated, expecting his co-stars like Art Carney and Audrey Meadows to simply adapt to his erratic timing and missed cues. If a crew member challenged his authority or a writer handed him a script he didn't like, his wrath was immediate. The bumbling, apologetic husband audiences loved was in reality a ruthless boss who ruled his production company through pure intimidation. The heaviest toll of Gleason's lifestyle, however, wasn't paid by his employees, it was paid by his own family. While he was making a fortune playing a deeply devoted husband, his actual home life was non-existent. His daughter, Geraldine, later reflected on a childhood where her father was essentially a ghost. Gleason ultimately abandoned his first wife and their 2 children, physically and emotionally checking out to pursue a lifestyle of relentless excess. He was known to spend lavish amounts of money on himself and his entourage, throwing legendary alcohol-soaked parties while entirely ignoring the emotional needs of the children he left behind. Orson Welles once reportedly described Gleason as one of the most selfish men he had ever met, and the reality of his personal life strongly supports that verdict. Audiences rooted for Ralph Cramton, because underneath all the yelling, he was a family man who always tried to do the right thing. It is a bitter irony that the legendary actor who brought him to life spent his entire career running away from those exact responsibilities. Number 8. Andy Griffith. If you hear that famous whistling theme song, you immediately picture Mayberry. For 8 seasons on The Andy Griffith Show. Sheriff Andy Taylor was the ultimate symbol of American patience and rural decency. He was the calm center of a chaotic town, a lawman so secure in his authority and so deeply committed to peaceful resolutions that he didn't even carry a loaded gun. But the man who made a fortune dispensing quiet wisdom on television was largely incapable of managing his own emotions. Behind the folksy charm, Andy Griffith was plagued by deep insecurities, severe alcohol dependency, and an explosive, unpredictable temper. The reality of working and living with him was often an exercise in walking on eggshells. The most glaring physical proof of this volatility actually happened right in the middle of producing his wholesome sitcom. During a fit of unchecked rage, Griffith punched a wall so hard he shattered his hand. The production schedule was thrown into chaos, and writers had to hastily invent a storyline to explain why the peaceful sheriff of Mayberry was suddenly wearing a heavy medical cast, carefully hiding the star's violent outburst from the American public. His domestic life mirrored this instability. It was marked by bitter divorces and an emotional turbulence that stood in stark contrast to the perfect, steady family dynamic he supervised on screen. While some core cast members, like a young Ron Howard, always spoke of him with affection and respect, others who encountered Griffith particularly later in his career on the set of Matlock described a notoriously demanding boss who readily used intimidation to control his environment. Griffith was an undeniably brilliant performer, but the gap between the character and the actor remains staggering. Millions of viewers tuned in every week to watch Sheriff Taylor diffuse tense situations with a warm smile and a gentle conversation on the front porch. But for the people in Andy Griffith's actual life, disagreements rarely ended with a smile. They usually ended with a slammed door, a screaming match, or a broken wall. Number 9. Larry Hagman. In the summer of 1980, the entire world was asking one single question: who shot J.R.? As the ruthless Texas oil baron J.R. Ewing on the primetime phenomenon Dallas. Larry Hagman created the ultimate television villain. Millions tuned in every week to watch him lie, cheat, and scheme his way to the top. The public loved to hate him, assuming the man beneath the iconic cowboy hat was simply a dedicated professional playing a part. But the reality on the set of Dallas was deeply toxic for an entirely different reason. Hagman wasn't a calculating mastermind in real life. Instead, he was sustaining one of the most severe, unchecked alcohol addictions in Hollywood history, effectively sleepwalking through his most famous role. This wasn't a dark secret hidden away in a dressing room. It was an openly tolerated reality on the studio lot. Hagman himself later admitted that he was practically never sober while filming the hit series. His co-star, Patrick Duffy, openly recounted their bizarre daily routine, noting that they would regularly crack open champagne first thing in the morning. By Hagman's own unapologetic estimation, he was consuming up to 5 bottles of champagne a day, every single day, right in the middle of production. What makes this chapter of television history so unsettling is the industry's complete complicity. Because Dallas was a massive money-making juggernaut network, executives and producers simply looked the other way. Hagman's behavior was a glaring liability, but as long as he hit his marks and delivered that famous sinister laugh, the studio allowed him to actively destroy himself on company time. The physical toll of this arrangement was devastating, eventually forcing Hagman to undergo a life-saving liver transplant in the 1990s. J.R. Ewing was famous for always being the smartest man in the room, a character who thrived on having absolute unbreakable control over everyone around him. Yet the bitter irony is that the actor bringing him to life had completely surrendered control of his own reality, masking a desperate, life-threatening dependency behind the confident smirk of television's favorite bad guy. Number 10. Mickey Rooney. In the golden age of Hollywood, nobody captured the optimism of American youth quite like Mickey Rooney. As the star of the wildly popular Andy Hardy film series, he was the ultimate boy next door, energetic innocent, and always ready with a bright smile. He built a staggering 9-decade career on the image of a scrappy, lovable underdog who could win over anyone with sheer charm. But that boundless, cheerful energy on screen masked a deeply volatile and destructive reality off-camera. Rooney's private life was a chaotic revolving door of gambling debts, explosive rage, and 8 fractured marriages. While the public saw a romantic, charismatic leading man, the women who actually married him experienced something far darker. The reality of his domestic life was sharply articulated by his 4th wife, actress Elaine Devery. She described a relationship defined not by love, but by severe emotional instability. Rooney was known for his terrifying temper, frequently directing degrading, verbally abusive outbursts at his partners whenever he felt challenged or lost control of a situation. The cheerful boy next door was, in the privacy of his own home, a highly aggressive man who routinely used his fame and volume to belittle the women in his life. However, Rooney's story doesn't end with a clean narrative of an abuser simply walking away. It ends with a deeply grim twist of fate. Decades after leaving a trail of emotional wreckage behind him, the man who had spent his life dominating others lost all control over his own existence. In his final years, Rooney appeared before a United States Senate committee to testify that he was a victim of severe elder abuse. He detailed how he was financially drained, intimidated, and kept a virtual prisoner in his own home by a family member. It is a staggering, uncomfortable arc to process. The golden boy, who spent his youth projecting pure all-American joy, spent his adulthood inflicting emotional pain on his closest companions, only to spend his twilight years trapped in the very cycle of abuse he had once perpetuated. The bright smile of Andy Hardy was in the end replaced by a devastating reality of domestic chaos. Number 11. Walter Brennan. If you turn on classic television networks today, you will still see Walter Brennan playing the ultimate American grandfather. As Amos McCoy on The Real McCoys, he perfected the archetype of the lovable, crotchety old farmer who might complain a lot but always had a heart of gold. With 3 Academy Awards under his belt, Brennan was universally adored for his folksy charm and rural wisdom. He was the sweet old man everybody wished they had in their family. But the grandfatherly warmth he projected to the cameras was a carefully constructed mask, hiding a reality rooted in intense prejudice and extreme political paranoia. Behind the scenes, the lovable farmer was actually one of the most aggressively reactionary figures in Hollywood. Cast and crew members quickly learned that working with Brennan meant navigating a minefield of hostility. If anyone on set expressed a differing opinion or even suggested slightly progressive ideas, he would frequently brand them a communist, fostering an environment of suspicion and tension. This wasn't just old-fashioned grumpiness, it was a deeply entrenched prejudice. During the late 1960s, Brennan didn't just quietly hold conservative views. He actively threw his wealth and considerable public influence behind George Wallace, a politician running explicitly on a platform of permanent racial segregation. The darkest glimpse into his true character, however, occurred on a day of national tragedy. On April 4, 1968, the country was plunged into mourning, following the assassination of civil rights leader Martin Luther King, Jr. While millions of Americans grieved, accounts from the set of Brennan's series, The Guns of Will Sonnet, described a chillingly different reaction. When the news of the murder reached the production, Brennan didn't offer sympathy or respectful silence. Instead, witnesses reported that the beloved television icon actually expressed joy, openly celebrating the fatal shooting of the civil rights leader. It is a deeply unsettling reality to process. Walter Brennan built a massive, enduring legacy by playing a man whose door was always open and who supposedly loved his fellow neighbor. Yet the man reading those wholesome lines harbored a profound, venomous resentment for a massive portion of the country he claimed to represent. The sweet grandfather of classic television was in reality driven by a deeply ugly prejudice that he barely bothered to hide. Number 12. William Frawley. When you think of the golden age of American television, Fred Mertz from I Love Lucy is practically carved into its Mount Rushmore. He was the ultimate lovable curmudgeon, the frugal, grumpy, but fiercely loyal landlord and husband to Ethel. For decades, millions of viewers laughed at their constant bickering, assuming they were watching two brilliant actors with flawless comedic chemistry. But that on-screen bickering wasn't a performance. It was a reflection of genuine toxic hatred. The man who played television's favorite grumpy neighbor wasn't secretly a sweetheart off-camera. William Frawley was a severe alcoholic with a deep, unapologetic streak of misogyny, and he turned the set into a hostile workplace, particularly for his television wife, Vivian Vance. When Vance, who was over 2 decades younger than Frawley, initially complained about being cast as his wife, Frawley didn't just get his feelings hurt, he retaliated with pure venom. Throughout the entire run of the legendary show, Frawley routinely hurled vile misogynistic slurs at Vance right in front of the cast and crew. He would loudly complain about her appearance and aggressively belittle her talent. It was never playful banter. It was a relentless campaign of verbal abuse that Vance was forced to endure just to do her job. His unreliability was just as dangerous as his temper. Frawley's drinking problem was so severe and widely known in Hollywood that no one wanted to hire him. Before I Love Lucy even began filming, producer and star Desi Arnaz had to force Frawley into a rigid, humiliating contract clause. If he showed up to the set drunk even once, he would be instantly fired and blacklisted. The animosity ran so deep that years later, when the network pitched a highly lucrative spin-off focused entirely on Fred and Ethel, Vance firmly rejected it. She walked away from a massive payday because the thought of spending another day working with Frawley was completely unbearable. The bitterness was so profound that when Frawley passed away in 1966, Vance famously did not mourn him. According to her co-stars, when she heard the news, her reaction was a celebration. The couple that defined comedic marriage for generations of Americans was in reality locked in a bitter, venomous feud. The audience heard punchlines, but Vivian Vance spent years listening to insults. Number 13. Buddy Ebsen. If you grew up watching The Beverly Hillbillies. Jed Clampett was the ultimate symbol of folksy, unassuming kindness. Played by Buddy Ebsen, Jed was the patriarch who accidentally struck oil, moved his family to a mansion, but never let the wealth change his sweet neighborly values. He was the kind of man who would invite anyone to sit at his dinner table regardless of who they were or where they came from. But the actor wearing Jed's battered felt hat operated with a much colder, far more vindictive set of rules. Behind the scenes, Ebsen wasn't an easygoing mountain man. He was fiercely rigid in his worldview, and he possessed a ruthless streak that he was perfectly willing to weaponize against his own colleagues. The target of this hostility was his longtime co-star, Nancy Kulp, who famously played the brainy birdwatching bank secretary Miss Jane Hathaway. For 9 seasons, they worked side by side creating comedy gold that generated massive profits for the network. But when the cameras stopped rolling, their relationship was defined by bitter ideological clashes. Epson was a staunch conservative. Culp was a progressive liberal. For years, it was just backstage friction. But in 1984, Epson crossed a line that completely shattered their professional history. After retiring from acting, Nancy Culp decided to run for a U.S. congressional seat in her home state of Pennsylvania. When Epson found out his former co-star was running as a Democrat, he didn't just quietly disagree. He proactively reached out to her Republican opponent and volunteered his services to actively destroy her campaign. Epson recorded devastating radio and television commercials that were broadcast all over Culp's district. In the ads, he actively leveraged his wholesome trusted persona to attack her character, explicitly telling voters that she was too liberal for Pennsylvania and advising them not to trust her. The betrayal was staggering. Culp ultimately lost the election by a significant margin. She was deeply hurt, later expressing her absolute heartbreak that someone she had worked alongside for nearly a decade would go out of his way to publicly humiliate and sabotage her out of pure personal spite. Jed Clampett was famous for his welcoming catchphrase, "Y'all come back now you hear," but for Buddy Ebsen, basic loyalty ended the exact second you stepped out of line with his personal politics. Number 14. Arthur Godfrey. Long before daytime talk show hosts learned to look directly into the camera and act like your best friend, there was Arthur Godfrey. Known affectionately as the Old Redhead, Godfrey practically invented the illusion of television intimacy in the 1950s. He sat behind a microphone, strummed a ukulele, and spoke with a slow, folksy warmth that made millions of Americans feel like he was sitting right at their kitchen table. He was the undisputed, trusted voice of the nation. But that relaxed, easygoing chuckle was a carefully guarded fortress for a massive, fragile ego. Behind the scenes, Godfrey didn't view his cast and crew as a family. He treated them as subjects in a strict dictatorship. He demanded absolute, unwavering loyalty and tightly controlled every aspect of his performers' careers. If anyone began to shine a little too brightly or stepped out of his shadow, his folksy charm immediately vanished, replaced by a ruthless need to reassert his dominance. Nobody learned this faster or more publicly than a young singer named Julius LaRosa. LaRosa was a breakout star on Godfrey's show. He was immensely talented, and the audience adored him. As his fan mail started to rival the host's, Godfrey's jealousy began to simmer. The breaking point arrived when LaRosa committed what Godfrey considered an unforgivable sin. He hired his own personal manager. To Godfrey, this wasn't a career move. It was an act of treason against his control. So Godfrey decided to send a message. On October 19, 1953, he let LaRosa perform his scheduled song. Then, as the live national television and radio broadcast was wrapping up, Godfrey casually stepped up to the microphone and announced to millions of listeners that this performance was Julius LaRosa's swan song. He fired the young singer on live television without ever giving him a private warning. It was a calculated humiliation designed to remind everyone who held the absolute power on set. But the stunt backfired entirely. The sheer unnecessary cruelty of the on-air ambush shattered the illusion of the friendly ukulele-strumming neighbor. The public and the press immediately turned on him, finally seeing the cold, vindictive reality he had hidden for years. Arthur Godfrey built a broadcasting empire by pretending to be everyone's friend, but he ultimately derailed his own career by proving he couldn't handle sharing the spotlight with anyone else. Number 15. Broderick Crawford. When a reckless driver sped down the roads of 1950s America, millions of viewers knew exactly who was coming to stop them. As Chief Dan Matthews on the massive hit series Highway Patrol, Broderick Crawford was the ultimate symbol of law and order. He was a gruff, no-nonsense cop who barked orders into a two-way radio and relentlessly pursued anyone who dared to put the public at risk on the asphalt. But the man delivering those stern television lectures about traffic safety was actively committing the exact same offenses the moment he stepped out of his prop patrol car. Behind the badge, Crawford was consumed by a severe, unapologetic alcohol addiction. His drinking was so chronic and predictable that the production crew actually had to structure the entire shooting schedule around it. Directors learned very quickly that if Crawford had dialogue, it had to be filmed before noon. By the afternoon, he was often too intoxicated to reliably remember his lines or hit his marks. The most jarring aspect of this reality was the impossible position it put the actual police in. Highway Patrol was made with the direct cooperation of the real California Highway Patrol, who provided technical advisors for the set. Instead of just consulting on scripts, these real-life officers frequently found themselves acting as Crawford's unofficial handlers. They were constantly trying to keep the star of their biggest public relations tool out of a real jail cell. Despite their efforts, Crawford's behavior was unchecked. He was repeatedly pulled over and arrested for driving under the influence. It became such a notorious open secret in law enforcement circles that real officers gave him the mocking nickname Old Feuds 2, a direct reference to the state's police code for drunk driving. While audiences watched him heroically pull over reckless drivers on television, Crawford was actively endangering the public on the actual highways of California. The man who built a television empire representing the absolute authority of the law spent his private life treating it like a suggestion he was simply too famous to follow.